Welcome to this special presentation of Investing in Psychedelics, brought to you by the Canadian Securities Exchange in partnership with CFN Media. Hi, my name's Anna Serin. I'm Director of Listings Development with the Canadian Securities Exchange. I'm joined here today in our Investing in Psychedelics micro series, and I'm joined here today by Dr. Roger McIntyre. Dr. Roger McIntyre is CEO of Champignon. He's Professor of Psychiatry and Professor of Pharmacology at University of Toronto. Thank you so much for joining me today, Roger.
And it's an absolute pleasure being with you. Thanks for having me.
We're excited that Champignon Brands will be joining us in our series, and we have our live event obviously on June 17th. So thank you very much for participating in that. It's been a really interesting, fast-growing sector. We have a bunch of public as well as private companies that will be joining us. So we're excited to have you join us then. But today I wanted to really kind of use you as a thought leader in the space, just the amount of knowledge and expertise that you bring. I wanted to pick your brain a little bit further. So why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in this sector?
I'll be pleased to. And thanks for starting with that question. I think I came at this sector a little different than some insofar as I am a psychiatrist. I'm a physician, and I trained also as a pharmacologist, and I'm a professor, as you said, in both of those areas. About 23 years ago, I started Canada's largest mood disorders center, which was dedicated to the research and the treatment of adults who suffer from depression and related disorders. It's been an incredible journey. It's been a surreal and very privileged career that I've had, and that privilege has been given by my patients. And what I've observed in that time has been success. I love success, and I've seen success, but I've also seen too often non-success. And what I mean by that is the available treatments that we've had for depression really have not been sufficient for most people. Sufficient meaning patients feel better, they're working better, they're functioning better. And just to put a percentage on that, about 75 to 80% of patients do not actually achieve the goals that they look for, to feel better, to work better, to live better. And that, for me, has always created a sense of disquiet for me, a sense of agitation. And we're always limited by the state of our science. And the state of our science did not really provide a line of sight for us in psychiatry, meaning we didn't really have any novel medical avenues to pursue. Much of the treatments for depression and related conditions have been with us for the better part of 6 to 7 decades. Only in the last few years, say 5 to 6 years, what's happened is we've now come to appreciate a line of sight with psychedelics, a line of sight with ketamine as potential treatments for depression. But here's the part that was really exciting. The part is that it wasn't just a novel avenue for depression. It was an avenue for depression that could get patients better at a much higher rate than we were used to, rather than the incremental gains that we would see with most of our treatments. We're talking about quantum gains. In other words, people would get better 60 to 80% of the time.
Wow.
And the part for me that was really the zinger was that patients would get better within a couple of days. To put that in sort of context, when the conventional treatments work, which is not that often, it takes between 6 and 12 weeks. So the notion of working at such a high rate, working so quickly, and doing what patients want, to feel better, live better, think better, work better. This is what people want. And the ability to offer what patients wanted was really the incentive for me to set up Canada's first ever integrated ketamine center for depression, as well as the first center in Canada to conduct randomized controlled trials with psychedelics for depression in this country.
Well, and I think one thing that's important to think about in that process is that it's not just 6 to 8 weeks for them to work. Sometimes it's not the right drug for the patient. So a patient who is suffering from depression, which is a very, I would imagine for yourself and all the professionals out there, it's a very scary situation to be in, to try and manage them through it. It could be 6 months before they're on the right medication, the right dosage, and a lot can happen to somebody in that period of time. So it's kind of amazing. Is there a reason why we haven't played around with this as a possibility to treat these types of disorders before?
A couple of factors were at play. I think one of the factors that certainly was no fault of our own was the limit of the science. The brain is obviously the most complex organ in our body, and neuroscience developments in the last decade have been surreal. The way we look at the brain, understand the brain, the way we've been able to understand how it is relevant to depression and other brain-based disorders, that really became enlightening for us in the last 5 to 10 years. So that's the first part. The second part is I think with these treatments that we've talked about, psychedelics and ketamine, let's face it, there's a history with these medications. So first of all, I think most would know that they are scheduled drugs in many parts of the world. In other words, they are drugs that would not be for regular purpose, over-the-counter, things of that nature. And along with that, they have an association in the minds of many people. For example, when I talk to patients about ketamine or psychedelics, the first thing they ask me is, oh, aren't those medications for parties and raving and counterculture and hippie culture? And aren't those veterinary medicines? I often get that question as well. And so what the patient and what people I think are reacting to is a history. These medications have a history in all of these areas. And what's less well known is the idea of repurposing. Repurposing simply means we take something off the shelf that has been sitting there for a little while for one reason or the other, and we say, hey, based on our science that we know today, not the science we knew 30 years ago, the science we know today, can that agent that we take off the shelf, can that agent actually benefit people who are suffering? And what the science told us is that what psychedelics do in the brain and what ketamine does in the brain may actually be very therapeutic for people with persistent and serious medical disorders like depression, like post-traumatic stress, like drug and alcohol. So in other words, I guess you could say there's been an alignment of sorts. The science aligned up in a certain way with what we understand about the pharmacology of these medicines. It certainly helps, I will say this, that the Food and Drug Administration in the United States has declared that both psychedelic and ketamine are breakthrough drugs in psychiatry. That's obviously important because it's one thing for a person who's interested in the area to say, oh, these are relevant treatments, these are exciting avenues to pursue. But when the government says that these are breakthrough treatments, that I think provides another vote of confidence. I think it's a certain degree of credibility. And I also think it actually is a statement that yes, that was then the counterculture and the party application and so on, but this is now. And that is, there is an opportunity to apply these treatments for people who have bona fide, legitimate medical disorders to really not just help them, but to help them in ways we've never seen before.
Well, and I think you brought up a really good point, and that's something that I even experienced myself is, when this first started coming to our marketplace, is this discussion around our emotional reaction to what these products are in our personal lives, whether somebody has experienced them or whether somebody knows somebody that has experienced them from a recreational perspective. So what can you talk on, because what we're talking about and the companies that are coming to our market for the most part are very much a medicinal play, not a recreational play. So maybe you can discuss what that relationship is and kind of how they're separate. I think I lost you, Roger.
Absolutely, and certainly at
Oh, there you
Champignon,
are.
beyond the medical application. Oh, can you hear me
Sorry,
now?
Roger. We just lost you for a second. So why don't we start? Why don't we just start there again?
Okay, sure.
So Roger, why don't you tell us a little bit about the relationship, of these products being used on a medicinal side versus a recreational side?
Yeah, it's my view that at this time that our focus should be on the medical application of these treatments. For example, ketamine, which is approved in Canada, the United States, as well as the European Union for the treatment of depression, explicitly states that this is only for medical application, and I agree with that. Secondly is the psychedelics, as we develop them, at least in the short term, I think really should be focused on the medically ill patient. I think that's relevant for a host of reasons. First is I think that it provides for us clarity as to who is the appropriate person to take the treatment. In other words, look, we all know that medication or any kind of substance is not right for everybody. And by having caution and careful contemplation as to who the people are, I think that is actually good for the person and obviously good for the safety of the product. The second part about that is the medical development by its very nature is a rigorous development process. And rigor is going to be key here because when we're talking about these types of treatments, psychedelics and ketamine, it's important that they're taken properly, they're taken with good quality assurance and all the usual measures of what quality assurances are, but also there's something called really expectancy bias. What does that really mean? Well, look, many people have tried psychedelics, many people have tried ketamine, and they know what the experience is like. If they haven't tried them, they've certainly read about them on the internet and so on. And if in fact you are taking an intervention like a psychedelic or ketamine that you know to have powerful psychoactive effects, that could, in many cases, could influence your interpretation of how it's benefiting you. We call that an expectancy bias. And one way to get around expectancy bias is to use placebo-controlled trials and to use various masking techniques. Again, details for another day, but the point is this is a very rigorous methodology. And the purpose of that rigorous methodology is to really know with the utmost certainty that the treatment's safe, and secondly, that it works. And that it works can only be demonstrated in placebo-controlled studies wherein you're really trying to adjust and control for the expectancy. So I happen to believe strongly that in the interest of safety, in the interest of the efficacy of the treatment, you want to really be very cautious and rigorous, and I think we start with the medically ill. Now, look, to keep the conversation going on that topic, do I foresee a time in the future where in fact they could be used in other ways? I'm not talking about recreational ways, but could they be used in other people? Could they be over the counter at some point in time? Well, I think anything in life is possible, but I think before you get to that, what we need to do is have clarity, caution, and I think very thoughtful, really design and execution of the studies so that we know for certain that these interventions can work and are safe. And then from that knowledge point, we can then branch in different directions.
Here's a question for you. The other side effect of some of the antidepressants that have come to market have some fairly long-term and severe side effects. Is there a difference there between the application of ketamine versus these?
It's a great question. And, in my experience or throughout my experience in over 20 years, prescribing to thousands of people, literally, antidepressants, side effects have been a real problem. Now, there's different types of side effects. There's different people who have side effects, and not everyone's the same. But the side effects that people not infrequently will experience with conventional antidepressants are side effects that really nobody wants, like weight gain. A lot of the medications make people feel very sedated and drugged, almost like a zombie. A lot of patients will say that they feel that their ability to perform sexually has been impaired. A lot of people describe what we call a blunting. They feel very blunted. They don't kind of react to things, good or bad. And so these are obviously not what people want. And part of that is because of the concept which we call off-target. What does that really mean? When I give an antidepressant to a patient, what the antidepressant is doing is two things. The antidepressant is targeting parts of the brain that I want to target, but the antidepressant is also targeting places I don't want to target, and that's called the off-target. And the problem with off-target is it just causes side effects and burden. What we need is a more laser approach to doing this, a more precise way of doing this, and the psychedelics and ketamine provide a more precise targeting of the brain with less of the off-target. Now, I'd like to say that they are perfect drugs. They don't have any off-target. There still is some off-target. And at Champignon, what we're trying to do is refine this so that we optimize to a great extent the on-target and we really eliminate the off target. That would be the ideal, and that's what we're aiming to do with our own products. So yes, so on that alone, I would expect that ketamine and psychedelics would have a lower overall burden of side effects for patients. The other part about this, which is really exciting, is that if you go to a care provider in North America, around the world today, for depression or post-traumatic stress or anxiety, he or she's going to prescribe an antidepressant to you, and you take it every day. You take it every day, at least for 6 months to a year, sometimes 3 to 5 years, sometimes for the rest of your life. The point is you take it every day. What's so different about psychedelics and ketamine, you don't necessarily take them every day. It's what we call episodic treatment. So you take it intermittently. So for example, our experience with ketamine is patients will take it maybe once a month, once every maybe 6 weeks in some cases, but not every day. And so obviously, if you're not taking it every day, that also reduces the side effect risk. So 2 points. First, these newer treatments, newer meaning how we're developing them, psychedelics and ketamine, have less off target. Secondly, you don't take them every day. So that has a implication for the side effect risk. So taken together, yes, we think they're going to have a lot lower side effect burden.
Roger, I just wanted to point out, I'm starting to lose a little bit of your face, and we want to make sure that we see your whole lovely face during this discussion. Perfect. Thank you. That brings up a question, that also is going to hurt the bottom dollar for pharmaceutical companies if they come to market with this. Do you think that this is making them a bit nervous?
No, I don't. And the reason I don't think so is because of, again, the four-letter word called cure. Unfortunately, psychedelics and ketamine are not yet a cure. Now, we still look for a cure. We're aspiring towards a cure. I believe a cure can be obtained. I hope it's going to be obtained sooner than later. It's aspirational, but we don't have it yet. And the reality is that the great majority of people, meaning more than 75 to 80% of people who benefit, for example, from ketamine, will need to take indefinite treatment of ketamine. And again, I said every month or so, but it could be every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks. Everyone's going to be different on this. Our experience is really that there's a wide range ranging from every 2 weeks to every 6 weeks. Again, details for maybe another time, but the point being, this is an indefinite treatment. So I do not think that there is necessarily concern, because these are not treatments that will be taken only for 2 to 4 weeks and that's the end of it. They need to be taken indefinitely in most cases.
Right. Now, one thing that you've brought up a few times within this discussion is we've had a lot of discussions around the application of mushrooms in the psychedelic space, but ketamine is definitely one that is part of that grouping that's coming to market. Tell us about ketamine. What is it? Why don't we start there? What is it?
Yeah, ketamine is a drug that was, it's certainly well-known agent. It was first synthesized way back in the early 60s, 1962 to be exact. It actually was first approved by the US FDA back in 1970. So 50 years ago it was approved. What was it approved for? It was approved as an anesthetic. It's been used in surgery, it's used every day and around the world as an anesthetic. Ketamine, about 15 years ago or so, was really rediscovered. Again, that repurpose that we talked about earlier, insofar as the observation was made. Again, these are almost co-occurring observations. The neuroscience was telling us that the brain works in a certain way. And it was also discovered that ketamine does a certain thing to the brain. And those two co-occurring observations were a perfect marriage, because the light bulb moment occurred and people said, well, hang on, ketamine might be able to treat depression based on the hypothesis around how it works. Now, many people would think about ketamine as a party drug, as a drug of street abuse called Special K. Some may have heard of even K-holes, where people have very significant dissociation reactions. Again, just to be clear, I want to get too lost in the glossary here, but dissociation is sort of like out-of-body experiences, almost derealization experiences, things like that. Many people have tried ketamine in their time in their life, and they maybe had a K-hole experience. But the doses that we use to treat depression are actually quite low. they're about maybe 1/10, even 1/20th the dose that somebody would use on the street. They're very low dose. In fact, they're even about maybe a fifth, a tenth of the dose we use in anesthesia. So these are very low doses. We call them sub-anesthetic doses of ketamine, and it's turned out to alleviate depression, does it very quickly at a very high rate that we spoke to earlier. And there's a lead that we now have, which is very exciting, that ketamine might also reduce suicide. Suicide is not a mental disorder. Suicide is a behavior. It's a tragic behavior, and it's most often associated with depression. About 80% of people who commit suicide have depression, but suicide again can affect any type of mental or medical disorder. And some people who commit suicide don't even have a mental disorder. And what's exciting is that ketamine's under investigation right now as a potential treatment for suicide. And my goodness, that would be extraordinary for all of us, given the fact that we've seen a rising suicide rate, for example, in the United States, so-called deaths of despair, the last 15, 20 years. And there are legitimate concerns that the viral pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, will only amplify suicide. So taken together, ketamine has been with us now 50 years. Its repurposing in depression became something of a vision in the last 15 years, and it was approved by the US FDA for depression in 2019, and also in Europe in 2019 for depression, and in Canada in 2020, and has really delivered with respect to some of the objectives I spoke to earlier, getting patients feeling better, living better, thinking better, and working better.
That's amazing. Now, so you had mentioned the term for the amount that's given. Is that the same term as microdosing? So when someone refers to microdosing, is that the same thing, or is microdosing specific to mushrooms?
It's a great question. Microdosing, or what defines microdosing, is a bit like asking how long is a piece of string. It's going to depend. Microdosing means different things to how you define it. But what I could say is although we don't use that vocabulary, microdosing of ketamine, it sort of is microdosing of ketamine. Microdosing with psilocybin and other psychedelics, of course, has been well described. That is to use a dose that may not be as likely to create a trip experience, but would also at the same time allow the person to derive some type of benefit from it, some meaningful personal benefit without perhaps the full trip experience. That's kind of loosely how microdosing has been considered. With ketamine, we don't call it microdosing, we call it sub-anesthetic dosing. Patients at that dose that we give, which is relatively low, still have dissociation experiences. And again, remember, dissociation is like those out-of-body experiences, things like that. We call it depersonalization. But it's relatively mild, it's transient, lasts maybe half an hour to an hour. And the more the person has had infusions or treatments, the lower the likelihood, the lesser the severity of that experience. So it's a relatively mild event for most people. So yeah, you could refer to it as microdosing, but for some reason we haven't used that kind of language with ketamine as we have with the psychedelics.
Okay. And so ketamine is not considered, a psychedelic in the same way that a mushroom is. Is that correct?
That is correct. Ketamine is considered, for those who like to know the language, or what's called the nomenclature. Ketamine is called the dissociative drug, and psychedelics are called psychedelic drugs because they create a psychedelic experience. And ketamine can cause some psychedelic experiences, but it typically causes more dissociation. Again, some of the devil's in the detail here, but the dissociation is more that depersonalization, or what we call derealization, almost like your world around you is kind of a bit dream-like, so to speak. Some patients have Zen-like experiences on ketamine, or have different ways they perceive their own body. That can sometimes happen. But certainly on the doses that we are given medicinally to treat depression or trauma, or in some cases even drug and alcohol misuse, those types of experiences are very limited, actually.
And when somebody is taking a dose of this, does it impair their life in any way that, they can't drive a vehicle, they can't, operate heavy machinery? Is it that kind of an experience for them?
The short answer is yes, and that's rare. Notwithstanding, whenever we're designing practice parameters on how to deliver a treatment, like many things in life, we design practice parameters not for the usual outcome, but for the worst case outcome. In other words, what we do at our clinic when we give ketamine to treat depression, and no doubt we'll be doing this for psychedelics as well, once we move these products closer to uh, what we call phase 3 development, that is for the rigorous clinical trials for FDA approval. But what we do for both of these, and sorry, for ketamine, we will be doing for psychedelics, is we expect patients to be observed for at least half an hour up to 2 hours in our clinic, and then they're taken home by a friend, a colleague, a loved one, and we ask them not to operate a car, not to operate any machinery until they've had at least one night of sleep. And many people who are joining us for this discussion may have had their own outpatient procedure for one reason or another, for their own medical reasons. And they probably saw that instruction sheet that you had to be taken home by your friend or your partner or what have you, and not drive a car. Now, again, most times there's no issues. Patients are fully clear, fully lucid. Often they're sitting in our waiting room, kind of just agitated. They want to leave. They feel it's kind of boring, just sitting there, just being observed by us. But again, you enact practice procedures not for the usual outcome, but for the worst case outcome. And what we would not want is, some people do have reactions where they're a bit sedated. Maybe their reaction time might be off. Maybe there's a bit of discoordination. And the last thing anybody wants is this person to be on a highway with a motor vehicle, putting themselves and others at risk. So for that reason, we say, yes, no driving until at least one night of sleep. Someone takes you home, and we watch you for up to 2 hours in our clinic.
So you can manage your normal lifestyle. If you go under this therapy and you're using it every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, every 6 weeks, you can manage it in the sense that you take it on a night that you're able to go home and go to bed and rest until the following day. So it sounds like, it doesn't prohibit people from living their general lifestyles. Now, the interesting part is, I think, we saw this in the cannabis space, in the capital markets. These are not new products that are coming to market. They're just new products coming to the capital market space. And obviously you have, you've joined Champignon, which is listed with the CSC. So we're very happy to have you guys as part of our family. How do you see this, now kind of being on the capital market side, how do you see this developing? Are you going to see plays of mostly research and development? Where do you think the money really needs to get funneled to within the psychedelic sector?
It's such a great question. I think there needs to be at least a three-pronged approach to this. And this is exactly what we're doing at Champignon. By the way, my thinking around this, that we need a three-pronged approach, was not something I learned at the Wharton School of Business or at Harvard School of Business. It's something I learned from doing clinical research in depression for 25 years. And I've worked with all the major pharmaceutical companies for over 20 years in developing treatments for depression-related conditions. And what I learned in that time is that if, in fact, we're going to really move the needle, and that's what we're doing with these new treatments, there needs to be a trifecta approach to this. First, I think we need to have clinics. We need to have clinics that provide treatments to patients. I often use the metaphor of the Apple Store. We need an Apple Store that sells our iPhone and our iPad and our iWatch. We need to have that for a variety of reasons. First, we should be the arbiters of how this is done in a safe, best practices, and appropriate way. Full stop. That's relevant because the reality is that these treatments are treatments that should be given by people who know the area. The other part about that gets into the second and third part of my trifecta. What we know is that we need to develop treatments, ketamine derivatives, psychedelic derivatives, in a way that gives them a great chance for success. In other words, we're going to develop them. Success is defined very unequivocally. Does it get an FDA approval? And towards an FDA approval, we need to have a research and development process that, yes, has an asset. We have to have a treatment, But you also have to have implementation. So for 20 odd years, people have said to me, oh, what's the asset that you have? What's the asset you have? That's not the question. The question is, what's the asset you have, comma, and how are you going to develop it? Because unless you are controlling the centers that are taking the treatments, you're going to run into the same problem all the major pharma have had for 20 years in psychiatry. That is a very high placebo response rate and a very high failure rate of these treatments. Why does that happen? It happens because you need to carefully select the patients for the clinical trials. So our trifecta is we're going to actually have, we're already doing this, giving ketamine at our center in Toronto. We have a new acquisition in California in a positive, profitable way. And that provides itself multiples with respect to our business model. We're acquiring up to 7 clinics this year, 2020. We're looking at 20 more clinics in 2021 to 100 clinics the year after. And that's all in positive cash flow. At the same time, what we're going to be doing is we're taking our own IP products, psilocybin derivatives, ketamine derivatives, and thirdly, putting them in our own devices, IP-capable delivery systems that we can test in our own clinics. So we have our own clinics. We have the human capital in our clinics, meaning the people who are knowledgeable, who have the velvet gloves, who have the software, so to speak, to do this type of research. And you probably know that my center has been named the world's most influential center for depression research. So this is critical for what we're trying to do. So taken together, we want to provide the treatments here and now, as we are doing. We're increasing scales I described. That's not just educating us and giving us more and more knowledge. It's also managing risk, because R&D has tremendous risk. And the way we reduce the risk is by having a profitable business model now, and also disintermediation, taking out the intermediary. And the intermediary is the clinical research organization that every single sponsor in psychedelics, ketamine, and every drug has to use, except us. Because in fact, we already have the clinics, we already have the patients. We don't need to hire an intermediary to find patients in clinics. That consumes 75% of the time and the resource and decreases the quality. So the trifecta is we have our clinics, we have our assets, we have our delivery, and this is going to be very different. So the business proposition here is on what we're doing now, which we're increasing scale. The R&D will take new products to phase 2, and at that point, we'll be then partnering with some of the larger pharmaceutical companies that I've got relationships with after 20 years, Wilson & Johnson did with ketamine nasal spray, where that product was developed early on, in part at NIH in Washington, in part at Yale University. When the signal became relevant and interesting, J&J came into the story, picked it up. They found an IP avenue with this product and then took it through phase 3 and an FDA approval. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing.
Well, it's so interesting. I'm so excited to see what you guys are able to accomplish and where this is heading. On a final note, do you think that the implementation of psychedelics and products like ketamine, do you think these will be disruptors in the pharmaceutical space and in biotechnology and science space? Do you think that these will be a big game changer as far as how we handle pharmaceuticals going forward?
They're going to be a game changer in the true sense of the word, without superlative, without hyperbole. A game changer, truly. How? They work within 1 to 2 days. I mean, if you were depressed and you went to a care provider and the care provider says, I have a treatment that you can get better in 1 or 2 days or 6 to 12 weeks, which one do you want? Obviously, the question is you would never ask the question. Secondly, is patients knock it out of the park. In other words, get their lives back with the existing treatments 10 to 20% of the time. With these treatments, it's 60 to 70% of the time.
Wow.
So that has implications not just for patients, but it's implications for payers. Because in Canada, United States, the entire OECD group of nations, even the low and middle income countries, depression is the #1 cause of disability. It affects people early in life, in their teenagers, 20s, 30s, and 40s, and unfortunately it's chronic. So actuaries and a whole host of cost effectiveness models have shown if we have treatments that are truly better and work faster and affect the outcomes that patients desire most, to be able to think and perform, this is a very, very, very cost-effective treatment. And this has justified the premium pricing that is in fact now being called for some of these treatments. So they will be a game changer for sure. We're seeing that with ketamine already. And I expect you're going to see them not just be game changer, but you're also going to see them really serve as a gravitational pull. What does that mean? What that means is that the way they're going to shake this territory is you're going to see a whole variety of other new medicines in the horizon that maybe have been on the shelf that'll get repurposed, as well as very de novo new treatments that'll be born inspired by the neuroscience, inspired by what we've learned pharmacologically with these treatments, and frankly, inspired by the business reward that will now be in place for these new treatments.
That's so exciting. And I think too, there's obviously a large population out there that might just not even be able to afford, the current options that are out there. And so they have to make a choice not to take them,
Yeah.
for financial reasons. So I'm so thrilled at what potential there is. And I can't thank you enough for joining me, because I think it really is a very mystified space. I think there's a lot of things that we as a society feel about this space without knowing all this knowledge. So I'm excited to have people such as yourselves who are experts, who can kind of educate us, especially as investors are coming to market. They really should understand what the space is about, and make sure that they're implementing that into their due diligence. So anyway, thank you so much, Dr. McIntyre. I really appreciate the time that you've given me. I look forward to hosting you on the 17th, and we will have kind of a further discussion around this. I look forward to watching Champignon Brands and how you guys manage these waters. You've already had a great start, so we're excited to see where you guys take it from here.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I am as well. I'm extremely excited. I'm extremely honored. And above all else, I think this is going to be an impact for people that's going to be quite striking. So it's very exciting. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. We'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.